68 million Americans watched it, not because they were curious, but because they couldn't look away. It wasn't a scandal. It was a surgical strike against silence, and it landed inside the Supreme Court. No lawyers, no cameras, just Denzel Washington, and a truth so sharp it could split marble. He didn't plead. He didn't shout. He just looked the Chief Justice in the eye and said two words that cracked the room in half. "You're done." And in that moment, millions didn't see a courtroom. They saw a reckoning. The Supreme Court doors shut behind him with a mechanical finality, like a vault sealing a truth long buried. The marble halls whispered with the kind of cold that doesn't come from air conditioning, but from history itself, from laws etched in stone and blood. Cameras were banned, reporters were turned away, no live feed, no transcript. This wasn't a trial, it was a ceremony, a performance of justice, pre-written and tightly choreographed, until he showed up. No entourage, no badge, just one man, Denzel Washington. He didn't belong here, not according to protocol, not according to precedent, and certainly not according to Chief Justice John Roberts, who sat at the center like a monarch dressed in restraint. But Denzel didn't ask permission. He didn't knock. He entered the chamber like someone who already knew the outcome, but refused to let it stay unchallenged. He wore no robe, no pin, no protest shirt, just a charcoal coat and a look in his eyes that said he didn't come to speak. He came to expose. In his hand, a weathered manila folder, no name on it, just creases and fingerprints and pain. There was a murmur in the courtroom, not from the justices, but from the staff. The guards didn't move, but their shoulders tightened. One clerk glanced at another. No one said it, but everyone felt it. This wasn't supposed to happen. Roberts leaned forward slightly, just enough for the microphone to catch his voice. "This isn't a hearing for public commentary," he said, his tone dipped in polished frost. "This court doesn't entertain theater." Denzel stepped forward slowly, his boots tapping against polished marble like a war drum from another world. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, and when he spoke, the words didn't echo. They settled, like ash. "I'm not here to perform," he said, voice low but unmistakable. "I'm not acting. I'm breathing." Silence. Not even the sound of paper turning. Robert's expression didn't change, but something in his grip on the bench twitched. Barely. "This forum is not authorized for civilian," but Denzel cut him off. Not rudely, cleanly. "No, this forum isn't authorized for truth. That's why I'm here." One of the junior clerks shifted uncomfortably. Another judge looked away. Denzel's presence was not just disruptive, it was undeniable. The folder in his hand was no prop. It carried the weight of someone else's story, a story that had tried for over a decade to crawl through the cracks of this system only to be smothered by silence. "I read the ruling," Denzel said, lifting the folder slightly as if it weighed more than the bench itself. "I read every word you didn't speak out loud, the language you used to kill quietly. Insufficient basis. Procedurally closed. No federal interest." He looked directly at Roberts, not with rage, with something more dangerous, clarity. "You signed it, you sent it away, and you called that justice." Roberts' jaw tightened, but his face stayed composed, barely. "This court operates on precedent, not passion," he said. "Cases are decided on merit, not emotion." Denzel let out a breath, not quite a laugh, more like the ghost of one. "You say that like it's a virtue, but precedent is just tradition wearing a powdered wig. And merit? That boy never had a shot at merit. He was guilty the moment he was born in the wrong zip code with the wrong skin." A long pause, no one moved. The silence didn't feel like decorum. It felt like confession. Roberts sat back, his voice colder now. "If you're here to grandstand, Mr. Washington, I suggest you reconsider. This court is not the place for personal crusades." Denzel stepped forward once more. This time the folder opened. Inside, a photograph. Not of him, not of a protest, but of a child, maybe 12, maybe 13, smiling crookedly in a school uniform that didn't quite fit. A name scrawled in blue ink beneath it. Rashad Miles. The image was passed quietly to the clerk, from clerk to bench. Roberts didn't pick it up, but he saw it. Everyone saw it. Rashad, Denzel said softly, was sentenced to death in Mississippi. No DNA, no fingerprints, just one coerced statement. You refused the appeal. You called it a matter of state discretion. He was 14. A shift rippled through the chamber. A breath caught. Someone coughed just to fill the air. You talk about rules. I'm talking about a child you buried beneath them. Roberts didn't speak. His eyes remained locked, but the room around him seemed to tilt. This wasn't supposed to happen, he muttered under his breath. Not to Denzel, to himself. But Denzel heard it. He folded the file shut and stared up at the bench, his voice quiet, resolute, and ironclad. No, he said, it wasn't. That's why it matters. The photograph had barely landed on the bench before the room turned to stone. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was the kind of stillness that doesn't come from order. It comes from guilt, from recognition, from the sudden presence of a truth too heavy to ignore. Denzel didn't need to raise his voice. The silence was already screaming. He opened the folder fully now, spreading its contents like an autopsy on the altar of law. Pages frayed at the edges, handwritten notes, court transcripts with passages underlined in red ink. A single blood-red line circled a name over and over again, as if someone had tried to erase it from memory by making it impossible to forget. Rashad Miles. He was arrested at 13, Denzel began, voice even, eyes scanning each face on the bench. Charged as an adult. The accusation? He was seen near the scene. That's it. No fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon, just one man's word, who later recanted. He held up a signed affidavit from the supposed witness. It trembled slightly in his hand, not because he was nervous, but because the truth had a pulse. You call this justice? He asked, his voice tightening. You call this merit? Roberts remained still, hands folded. The case went through every legal channel. The process was followed. The appeals were reviewed. The system did what it was designed to do. Denzel stepped forward, slow but deliberate, like each step cracked through a layer of marble beneath his feet. Exactly. That's the problem. The system was designed to do this, to swallow boys like Rashad whole and spit them out before they can even learn what due process means. He lifted a page, a copy of the Supreme Court's final denial of appeal. It was only one sentence long, no explanation, no hearing, just a date, a signature, and a door slammed shut forever. And that signature right there, he said, pointing directly to the name at the bottom, belongs to you. Roberts didn't blink. Procedural closure. His attorneys failed to file within the statute of limitations. Denzel paused. He was 14. He was represented by counsel. This court does not make exceptions based on public sentiment. A bitter laugh slipped out, quick and sharp, like a match striking the edge of a matchbox. Denzel didn't laugh often, but this wasn't amusement. It was exhaustion laced with disbelief. This isn't about sentiment, he said. It's about the sentence. You knew the risk. You knew the flaws. You saw the same data we all did. Youth confessions, coerced statements, brain development. But you let him die. You signed that paper, walked away, and called it precedent. The judges beside Roberts shifted ever so slightly, not in disagreement, but in discomfort. The kind of subtle movement that says, I don't want to be part of this, but knows it's too late not to be. Denzel placed another photo on the bench. It wasn't Rashad's. It was his mother's, eyes hollow, hands clutching a folded American flag. Her son never served in the military, but that was the only flag she was ever handed. She wrote every member of this court, Denzel continued. No one replied, not even a form letter. He paused. Let the weight of that linger. Do you know what it feels like to scream into a system that was built to stay deaf? Roberts finally looked up. His eyes met Denzel's. For a second, just one, something flickered. Not shame, not regret, just fatigue. A crack in the marble. This court is not emotional, Roberts said quietly. It is constitutional? Denzel nodded. Then let's talk about the Constitution. He pulled out the last sheet in the folder. Not legal brief, not evidence. Just words, large, bold, handwritten, across an empty page. We the people. He held it up like a mirror. You forgot who the people are. You think it means lawmakers, clerks, and benches carved from privilege? But Rashad was one of them. His mother is one of them. The people don't end at this chamber's steps. He placed the paper gently on the bench. You want rules? Here's one. If the law no longer protects the innocent, it has no right to punish the broken. Roberts exhaled through his nose, a slow, restrained breath. The court cannot be held hostage by emotion. And I won't let it be a graveyard for truth. That line landed like a gavel. The room stayed quiet, but it wasn't the same silence from before. This one had shape. It had weight. It was listening. Denzel took one last look at the bench, at the faces behind it. Then he closed the folder. This is no longer about Rashad. It's about whether you have the courage to admit you buried him. And with that, he turned away, not in defeat, but in defiance, leaving behind a file that no one wanted to read, but that no one could ever unsee again. The folder sat on the bench like a ticking bomb no one dared defuse. But Denzel wasn't done. Not yet. Not even close. He reached into his coat and pulled out a USB drive, small and unassuming, yet what it carried had the power to fracture the very institution he stood inside. With the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a man who had waited years for this moment, he inserted it into the courtroom's lone screen. A low beep, then silence again. And then the footage began. Grainy, raw, unedited. A police interview room in Mississippi. A child, barely a teenager, sitting alone at a metal table. Fluorescent lights flickering. Two officers pacing behind him like wolves scenting weakness. No guardian, no lawyer, no food. 7 hours, Denzel narrated softly. And then, the statement they wanted. The video showed Rashad flinching. His voice cracked as he mumbled back lines that didn't even match the crime scene. One officer nodded, satisfied. The other turned off the camera mid-sentence. Next clip. A sealed body cam recording, released only due to a whistleblower. It showed the arrest. The boy on the ground. The officer muttering, "Black kids always run guilty." No one else on the bench had seen it before. Then came the medical reports. Hidden, delayed, redacted. No bruising consistent with the alleged crime. Timeline inconsistencies. Missing surveillance footage from a nearby gas station. Footage that mysteriously malfunctioned the day after the arrest. Every revelation struck harder than the last. And still, the justices said nothing. Not because they didn't care, because they didn't know how to respond. Roberts remained frozen, eyes locked on the screen, but jaw clenched as if trying to stare the evidence into silence. One more clip. This time a statement from a former district clerk, taped 6 months earlier. They told us not to push it, said it wouldn't look good if the Supreme Court overturned a case the media never covered. I filed the motion anyway. A week later, I was reassigned. The screen went black. Denzel let the silence settle. He scanned the faces in front of him. Cold, ashen, still. "Let me be clear," he said quietly. "I didn't come here to make you feel guilty. I came here to make sure you never get to say you didn't know." One justice, a woman in her 60s graying at the temples, shifted in her chair, lips slightly parted as if about to speak. But then, she stopped. Her gaze darted toward Roberts, and she swallowed her words. Denzel saw it. All of it. The flickers of conscience crushed beneath the weight of decorum. No one defended Roberts, but no one dared challenge him either. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just sits quietly in a black robe, while everyone else pretends they can't hear the bones cracking underneath. Roberts stood slowly, deliberately, the wood of his bench groaning beneath the shift. He slammed his hand on the surface, loud, sudden, sharp. The crack echoed through the chamber like a judge's gavel, though no case had officially begun. "This is not a court of public spectacle," he snapped. "You are not a party to this case. You are not a lawyer. You are not recognized by this institution in any official capacity." His voice rose, not to assert control, but to remind the room who still held the gavel. "You are out of order, out of line, and out of place." Denzel didn't flinch. He didn't look down. His breathing didn't change. If anything, it became steadier. "I'm not a lawyer," he said, calm as a razor's edge. "I'm not bound by your decorum. I don't answer to your procedures. I don't fear your titles." He took one step closer to the bench. His voice didn't rise, but every word struck like a hammer. "I'm a citizen, a witness, a man who has seen too many children buried under rulings like yours." The room felt like it was shrinking, not because it got smaller, but because the truth had filled it to the brim, and there was nowhere left to hide. Roberts leaned forward, eyes blazing now. "Then you have no place here?" Denzel stared back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He simply said it. Each word slow, deliberate, final. "You're done." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even anger. It was a sentence, a declaration, a funeral bell wrapped in velvet. The words didn't echo. They hung, heavy, alive, unshakable. And in that moment, the courtroom didn't feel like a courtroom. It felt like a reckoning, one dressed in silence, lit by flickering screens, and haunted by the truth that had finally broken through. The words "you're done" still echoed, not in the courtroom, but inside the people who heard them. Roberts sat frozen for a moment, staring at Denzel as if trying to summon the full force of the institution through his gaze alone. Then slowly, almost methodically, he reached down, pulled out a binder thick with case law, and flipped it open. The rustle of pages was mechanical, measured, dismissive, precise. He found the tab he was looking for, pressed it flat against the wood, and without lifting his head, spoke. "There was no misconduct," he said, his tone clinical. "The appeals process was followed to the letter. There was no constitutional violation, no denial of due process. The confession was on record. The timeline was ruled admissible. Every step of this case was consistent with judicial precedent." His voice was colder now, tighter, the voice of someone not just defending themselves, but defending the very seat they sit on. He looked up. "Legally, Mr. Washington, nothing was done wrong." Denzel didn't blink. He didn't counter with another document or another video file. Instead, he reached into his inner pocket, carefully, quietly, and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, soft and creased like something too precious to touch too often. It wasn't typed. It wasn't formatted. It wasn't evidence by any court standard. It was handwritten, blue ink on lined paper, the handwriting uneven, the punctuation imperfect, the pain flawless. He unfolded it, held it in both hands, and began to read. "To whomever still has a heart inside this system," his voice wasn't loud, but somehow the entire room leaned in. "My name is Clarice Miles. I am the mother of Rashad Miles. You don't know me, but I know you. You sit in rooms with perfect ceilings and polished wood, while my ceiling has water stains and a picture of my son nailed above a quiet dinner table no one eats at anymore." Denzel looked up briefly. Even the stenographer had stopped typing. "I know the case numbers. I know the deadlines. I know that some filing missed a window. But tell me, what window does a mother file through to bring her child back?" The letter shook slightly in his hands. "I've written this so many times, and I still don't know if it matters. Because if men in robes can read my son's name and feel nothing, then maybe I'm not writing to humans anymore. Maybe I'm writing to a machine. And if that's what justice has become, then let the world know what it truly is." He paused, not to gather breath, but to let the weight of those words settle into the marble. A machine that kills with silence. Denzel looked up, not at the justices, not even at Roberts, but at the empty air between them. "The rest," he said softly, "was smeared by her tears." Roberts didn't move. His jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't leave the letter. "That letter," he said after a long silence, "is not admissible." Denzel nodded. "You're right." He folded it once, twice, then gently placed it on the bench beside the law book Roberts had used as his shield. "It's not evidence. It's something rarer than that. It's humanity." Roberts spoke again, but his tone was faltering now, less a command, more an insistence. "This court cannot act based on emotion. The Constitution demands objectivity. If we allow grief to overtake rule, then law collapses into chaos." Denzel stepped forward. "No," he said, voice low but gaining gravity with every syllable. Law collapses into chaos when you pretend grief doesn't exist, when you hide behind footnotes and forget that every page you flip is someone's life breaking. He pointed at the bench, not with anger but with clarity. You think order means control, but order without empathy is not justice. It's theater. And if this court has become just a stage for lifeless rulings, then at least be honest about it. His voice didn't rise, but it deepened. If you can read a mother's cry and still say nothing was wrong, then maybe nothing is broken in the law, except the people interpreting it. Another justice looked down. One unclenched her hands. The air shifted, and Roberts, for the first time, didn't speak. Denzel stared at him, one final time. This is not an argument. This is a mirror, and you can keep pretending it's foggy, or you can finally look at what's staring back. The lights above hummed. No gavel, no objection, no closing remarks. Just a letter on a bench, and a silence that no precedent could defend. At some point, though no one could say exactly when, it stopped being a hearing. The robes, the formality, the architecture, all still there. But the air had changed. The rules had cracked. This was no longer a stage for procedure. It had become something far more dangerous, far more sacred, a court of conscience. The letter sat untouched on the bench, like a relic, its ink barely dry, its voice still reverberating. And for a moment, no one dared speak, not because they feared Denzel, but because the truth had stolen the breath from the room. Then movement, small, subtle. One clerk in the back, a young woman who had spent her entire legal career quietly turning pages and stamping seals, stood up. She didn't say a word, just stood, back straight, eyes forward, and then another beside her. Then two more. Roberts noticed. He turned his gaze toward them, and though he said nothing, the warning in his eyes was unmistakable. But they didn't sit. They didn't flinch. They had heard the letter, and for the first time in their lives, policy wasn't enough. On the right side of the room, one of the associate justices, an older woman, usually unreadable, lowered her glasses, removed them completely, and let out a breath so long it sounded like a confession. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from awareness. Beside her, another justice leaned forward as if about to speak, but caught himself. His fingers gripped the bench, his lips pressed tight, because deep down he knew. Any word spoken now would not be part of the record. It would be part of history, and history remembers. A camera technician in the back shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Officially, no cameras were allowed in this hearing. Unofficially, his pocket buzzed. A hidden lens, taped behind a panel, was live. It wasn't supposed to be, but someone backstage had flipped the switch. The feed was unstable, the angle off center. But it was enough. Enough to see the letter. Enough to catch the moment a Chief Justice lost his grip on silence. Enough to make the world lean in. Denzel hadn't moved. He stood at the center of it all, as if carved from something older than stone. His eyes scanned the room, not with pride, not with triumph, but with patience. The kind of patience born only from knowing you've waited your whole life for others to finally listen. "Do you feel it?" he asked gently. "That shift? It's not in the law books, it's not in the gavel, it's in the spine." He stepped closer to the bench. For decades, this court has ruled from above. But justice, real justice, doesn't trickle down. It rises up. From mothers, from children, from classrooms, from graves. He looked at Roberts, then slowly to each justice, locking eyes not as a performer, but as a mirror. "You don't need a new precedent. You need a new pulse." The room was still, but not frozen, alive in a way it hadn't been for years. And then, from the far left corner, barely audible, came the click of a pen. It was a paralegal, scribbling something down. She'd been silent for most of the session, but now her page filled line after line. Notes? Maybe. Or maybe testimony. Then a phone vibrated. Someone in the upper gallery. A text came through, 4 words. "It's happening. He's winning." Down below, the courtroom door cracked open for the first time in hours. Someone peeked in. A security guard gave a slow shake of the head, but didn't close it. He didn't slam it shut, because deep down even he understood something irreversible had begun. Roberts shifted in his seat. He looked exhausted now, not from the weight of the accusations, but from the quiet unraveling of control. Not a single gavel had been struck, not a single ruling handed down, but somehow he was already losing, and everyone could see it. "You wanted to bury it," Denzel said. "The case, the child, the voice. You filed it under too late and not our concern. But here's what you didn't count on." He stepped back, not out of retreat, but out of revelation. "You didn't count on the echo." Another justice looked down. The clerk in the back pulled her phone from her pocket. She wasn't texting. She was recording. Illegally, knowingly, willingly. Because some moments don't ask for permission, they demand witnesses. "Whatever happens after today," Denzel said, "whatever statement you craft, whatever ruling you release, understand this. The court of law may not convict you, but the court of history already has." The lights didn't flicker. The floor didn't tremble. But somewhere beneath the marble, something shifted. A silence was broken, not by noise, but by presence. There was no headline, no press release, no urgent ticker running across the bottom of a screen. The day after the hearing, Washington, D.C. went on exactly as it always had, on the surface. Suits clicked down marble steps, morning briefings were held, courtrooms convened. But beneath the hum of daily rituals, something cold and unfamiliar had begun to spread. It didn't have a name. It didn't need one. It moved in glances, in whispers, in the deliberate silence of those who suddenly stopped saying the name John Roberts aloud. No official video had been released. The Supreme Court issued no statement. The docket remained untouched, sealed in bureaucratic frost. But the footage, it existed. Smuggled, shaky, off-angle, but real. A copy had found its way to a congressional aide. Another ended up in the inbox of a civil rights nonprofit. A third, a lower-quality version with distorted audio, hit the encrypted inbox of a freelance journalist known for leaking what others wouldn't touch. None of them posted it. Not yet. They didn't have to. Because by that morning, the city already knew. Knew something had cracked in the walls of the highest chamber. Knew Denzel Washington had walked into the sacred court of power and left behind something more potent than a verdict. Doubt. And that doubt spread like a scent no one could trace, but everyone could smell. In offices across Capitol Hill, advisors replayed muted versions of the confrontation, analyzing expressions, dissecting pauses, studying the moment Chief Justice Roberts didn't respond. Staffers exchanged knowing looks. Think tanks quietly rewrote their talking points. PR teams rehearsed contingencies that no one had prepared for. No major network touched the story, but cable news anchors hesitated on air, pausing for half seconds too long when referencing the court. Articles mentioned Roberts only in passing. His name didn't disappear, but it dulled, like a photo left too long in sunlight. 1 week later, the administrative branch of the federal judiciary received a formal letter, unannounced, unsigned by any press secretary. It opened with clinical precision. Due to internal concerns regarding procedural integrity and potential conflict of interest stemming from a recent closed-door hearing, this office is initiating a preliminary ethics review of Chief Justice John G. Roberts. No charges, no accusations. Just a shadow. That same day, Roberts declined to sit on Allen v. Hargrove, a pivotal voting rights case he had previously championed as defining for the next century. No explanation, no opinion filed. Just an internal memo citing personal reasons. It didn't go unnoticed. Justice Harlow, long considered his ideological partner, requested clarification. She didn't receive one. A second justice, a moderate conservative, privately told colleagues that something had shifted in Roberts, that he had grown unreachable. Behind the curtain, staff described him as quieter, withdrawn. He canceled 2 closed-door conferences, declined a roundtable discussion on constitutional jurisprudence, walked past clerks without a word, stared longer than usual at the portraits of past Chief Justices lining the hallway outside his office. He hadn't lost his power, But he had lost something far more dangerous, his certainty. And in a city built on the illusion of unshakable men, that was fatal. Denzel, meanwhile, was nowhere to be found. No interviews, no podium, no statement. He returned to his private life as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just stared down the highest judge in the land and stripped him of the illusion of untouchability. But the city still murmured. In cafes near Dupont's Circle, in elevator pauses at think tanks, in hallway whispers at law schools. 4 words passed from mouth to mouth like an urban legend becoming prophecy. Denzel made him flinch. It wasn't just about Roberts. It was about what he represented and what it meant for a man so used to being the final word to suddenly feel watched. For decades, Roberts had ruled with a pen and a pulse unbothered by protest. He saw chaos and cooled it, saw fury and outlasted it. But what Denzel brought that no one else ever had was a question so moral, so human, it couldn't be argued down. If law ignores the cries of a mother, is it still justice or just cruelty in costume? The hearing would never make it into the official transcripts. The footage might never air. But the echo, unofficial, uncontained, undeniable, had already rewritten something fundamental, not in the Constitution, but in the conscience. And somewhere deep inside the highest office of law, the man who once believed he answered to no one, now listened for a voice he had tried to dismiss. It didn't scream. It didn't beg. It simply whispered, over and over, "You're done." He didn't win the case. There was no ruling, no gavel slam, no formal recognition. But in the shadows of the court, behind sealed doors and unread transcripts, a tectonic shift had taken place, and Denzel Washington had walked straight through the center of it, not as a lawyer, not as a judge, but as something far more disruptive in a room full of rules, a man who refused to shut up. In a system where victories are often measured in citations and footnotes, his weapon was neither statute nor strategy. It was truth, raw, unfiltered, and too human to fit neatly into a column of legal reasoning. He didn't argue the law. He didn't need to. He revealed it, exposing what it had become, what it had forgotten, and who it had left behind. Long after the hearing, when the marble floors had been swept and the lights dimmed, people kept asking, why? Why did he do it? Why walk into the highest court in America, knowing full well he had no authority, no standing, no permission? Denzel never gave a press conference. He never penned an op-ed or sat for a Sunday talk show. But someone, an intern at a legal aid clinic, caught him outside a community center in Baltimore, long after the headlines had faded. And when she asked him that same question, "Why did you do it?" he smiled, soft and steady, as if the answer had been waiting all along. "Because if I didn't speak up," he said, "the next kid wouldn't have anyone left to speak for him." That wasn't strategy. That was instinct. That was conscience. He didn't need robes or titles to enter the fight. He only needed conviction. And it turned out that was the one currency still powerful enough to bankrupt an empire built on indifference. Inside the court, ripple effects lingered. New clerks whispered about the Washington moment during orientation. Professors reworded their lectures about activist outsiders, cautioning now with a tone of respect rather than dismissal. Even the press, which had tiptoed around the story for fear of its political gravity, began quietly referencing it in editorials, never naming it directly, but always with phrases like, "a recent moment of reckoning," or "the growing influence of moral testimony." And still, Denzel stayed silent. He wasn't there to build a brand. He wasn't building a movement. He was simply fulfilling an obligation, the kind that isn't written down but passed on, whispered in the back seats of police cars, mouthed through visitation glass, stitched into the silence of mothers who've lost everything. He carried those silences like scripture, and when the time came, he recited them, not with rage, but with reverence. That's what made it impossible to ignore. In a world addicted to noise, Denzel had wielded silence like a scalpel, precise, deliberate, and irreversible. He hadn't come to burn the institution. He came to reveal it, to hold up a mirror and make them stare until they could no longer look away. What shook the court that day wasn't volume, it was vision. a reminder that law without heart is just policy with sharp teeth, and that sometimes the most important judgments are not written in legal briefs, but in the quiet choices we make when no one's keeping score. And as for Roberts, he never publicly addressed what happened. But over time, his decisions changed, just slightly. In one ruling, he cited the human impact of judicial delay. In another, he acknowledged the moral consequence of precedent left unchallenged. Small phrases, barely noticeable, but to those watching closely, they meant everything. Maybe it wasn't an apology, but it was an echo. And sometimes that's all truth needs to survive, a place to bounce off of. In the end, Denzel never returned to the Supreme Court. He didn't need to. He'd already carved something permanent into its foundation, not with law, but with legacy, not with permission, but with purpose. They called him a disruptor, an outsider, a man out of place. But history remembers him as something else entirely, a witness, one who refused to be silent, so that the system would never again claim it didn't hear the cries. Justice doesn't begin in courtrooms, it begins in conscience. Denzel didn't stand to win, he stood so others wouldn't be erased. In a world where silence is often safer than truth, he chose to speak. Not for glory, not for legacy, but for the boy who never got to grow up, and the millions like him who still wait to be seen. You don't need a robe to do what's right. You just need a heart that refuses to forget. Because when courage echoes in quiet places, it reminds the world. The most powerful voice is the one that refuses to vanish. If this story stirred something deep, don't scroll past it. Hit like, share it with someone who still believes silence is not safety, and subscribe to Justice Unscripted, where no robe is too sacred to question and no truth too uncomfortable to face. Turn on the bell, because the next chapter won't be clean. It'll be real. And it just might change how you see justice, forever. Now we ask you, what part of this story refused to let you breathe? Drop it in the comments. Let it be known. Let it be remembered. Let it be heard. Together. This dramatized story is based on real systems, real silence, and the kind of courage most institutions fear. It's not designed to entertain. It's designed to wake something up. Thanks for watching. And remember, justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it walks in with nothing but the truth and refuses to leave. This is Justice Unscripted.